What's up, everyone? It's Thomas with Real Broker here in St. Augustine, Florida. And today I have a very special show for you. I'm sitting with the master, the doctor, Alex Stewart here, who he's got a great background in lending, and he's kind of moved on. He's now a professor at UNF, and he's going to give us a look into our local market here that you're not going to see really anywhere else. So, Alex, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing great. I really love coming down to St. Augustine.
Yeah.
It's always a treat for me. And every time I come down here, the landscape looks totally different because of all the building.
Yeah.
It's nuts.
That's very true. Yeah. And most locals are not happy. Back in the day, and you live in Jacksonville, you're in Atlanta.
I've been here
Beach,
about
right?
9 years now.
Yeah. So you're pretty familiar with how things are going here. But for like when I was a kid, if like you said like, oh, Jacksonville's up there, St. Augustine's not Jacksonville. We're definitely not that. Now it's just like St. Augustine, Jacksonville now. Like we're all just merging into one. You know?
That's the way that all the big cities go. I mean, I grew up going to Colorado all the time because that's where I was born and my family's there. And when you go to Denver, it's kind of like that's what a big city is. You have the sort of the core that is that big city, but then there's all the suburbs around it. And it's just like this continuation. And I feel like, Jacksonville's we're the largest area. So whenever you look at the stats of the biggest cities and stuff, we sort of cheat because we have like the biggest area. So we include the most people compared to all the other cities that have all the suburbs. But it feels that way when you come down to St. John's, where it's sort of just like you're going through the suburbs into the other areas, and we're sort of connecting the two in the meantime.
You just look at US 1, like US 1 used to be nothing up to like Palencia, and then nothing up until Nocatee. And now like that whole strip of US 1, which is north to south, from St. Augustine to Jacksonville.
Yeah.
Pretty much all developed now. And it's getting more developed as we move in the future. So I don't, I like to think that St. Augustine has its own thing going on here, but St. Augustine and Jacksonville have a symbiotic relationship, I would say.
100%.
Yeah.
Well, St. Augustine feels like a cultural and culinary, little hotspot that gives Jacksonville another flavor. And there's two sides of it, right? There's the historic side, and then there's the new construction side that's sort of a little bit off of the coast a bit there. And they have a lot to offer. I mean, it's creating a lot of affordable housing for people, even though they may not feel like it too much, but it's giving people a place to go live, and they're getting a lot of value out of it. So a lot of people are moving there.
Well, the interesting thing too with like what I consider St. Augustine is essentially what's 20 minutes to downtown St. Augustine and the beach, right? Like that's where I grew up, right? Mm-hmm. So St. Augustine Beach is where I grew up. 32080, 84, and 86. Mm-hmm. If you're not in those zip codes, you really don't live in St. Augustine.
You're in St. John's.
You're in St. John's County. Yeah, exactly. You're not a part of like what St. Augustine is, and that is completely different. Like so, if you go just on the west side of 95, like master plan community, master plan community, master plan community, and that's what all of it is. Whereas like you're in this area here, most of it, well, it's just a 50-50 mix. You're going to have no HOA communities. You're going to have master plan communities, but they're going to be older. Almost none of them are brand new construction. Whereas like everything on the northwest part of St. Johns County, new build, but 99% of it. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's just a completely different lifestyle than living right here versus the other side of 95.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're going to go into a lot of data here today, which is something that I enjoy. So, bust out your pen and paper because this is going to be classes in session. Is that what, do you say that when you're a professor?
I wish. I don't have anything as cool to say like that. I usually start off asking the class how they're doing and to share something good. Mm-hmm. And I got that from another professor as a way to sort of create positive energy in the class before you get going. And the crazy thing that I've learned is that when you're in a classroom with realtors, the energy is high. Everybody's pretty much an extrovert, and they're excited to be in your class because they're not necessarily in class all the time, right? Class is almost a vacation from the regular job or the wheel that we all run in. When you go to the college campus, man, that's one other class out of many that they're taking.
True.
And in many cases, it feels like pulling teeth, trying to get in interaction and stuff. So I don't have anything that is like a catchphrase as much, but I always do try to start off with, hey, tell me something good. Somebody's seen something good, eaten something good, and had a good time. It doesn't matter what it is. Just start with something good, because we get plenty of not good anywhere else we look. I want to start with all the positive up front.
Okay. Well, you know what? Well, initially I said, let's start with the negatives, but let's start off with one positive that you see regarding the real estate market, either nationally, locally here to St. Augustine, or just Northeastern Florida.
Yeah. So I'll start off in a way that I would say this. I think more people are paying attention to the numbers than we've ever seen.
Yeah.
And that is the biggest positive that I could say. Now, it sort of is one of those things where the more you know, the more you realize you don't know anything, right? Now we have all this information, and it can be even more confusing once we add that into the mix. But our industry for the longest time, I think, has been shooting from the hip in many cases.
Yeah.
You know, we are going to judge the market based on our individual deals that we're doing, right? So if you have 5 deals going on and that's a lot for you, you're going to be like, the market's awesome. I'm so busy. Everything's really moving. It feels really good, compared to the other agent who could just be a block away, who's got no deals going on and is thinking about how the market is so slow and that it's just terrible and it's just really not a good market. And so by focusing on the numbers of our market and opening the door for realtors to have more clarity that way, what I think we do is we move ourselves towards a more accurate picture of reality. Yeah. And that's what if I were to say, what's my goal with all of this, is to try to help us all see the market more clearly, to have a more accurate picture of reality, because then we're all able to make a little bit more informed decisions. We're able to regulate our emotions more, because having been a mortgage banker for 8 years, I know what y'all feel, where we go through the month or two that's slow, and we literally go to the depths in our mind of like, is this the right career for me? Like, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. Yeah. To then you get one deal and it brings you back to the euphoria of, I love this job, right? I love real estate. This is so fun. And so if we can see the numbers clearly and we sort of have our eye on the big picture of what's going on, I feel like it helps us to not get to those depths and to not get to too highs, that we can sort of stay a little bit more even keel. And that helps us avoid burnout. That helps us avoid making bad advice to our clients or saying things that cause people to make certain decisions that are maybe not accurate. Yeah. So when it comes to what's good, I think we got a lot more people focusing on the numbers. Yeah. And, it's crazy because if we think back to 2008, I don't know how much of this information was even available, right?
I think about that a lot. Like, forecasting what's going to happen in the future, looking at inflation, interest rates, and, now people are reading charts. Like I know you post some charts of like just using, what do they call it?
Technical analysis.
Technical analysis, using technical analysis.
Sorcery.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You're kind of seeing into the future of what's going to happen. And I don't think that the consumer 2008, through 2012 was as educated as they are today. We just have so much more available, whether it's through social media or just going online and searching things. We just have so much more information available. Yep. And the agent 100% is way more educated today, I think. Well, the agents that are a part of the market distillery.
They have the ability to be.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If they're a part of the market distillery, they're better.
Yeah. Well, we don't realize this, but I remember sitting in college when we were going through 2008 and the iPhone literally just came out. Yeah. Like the first one. Yeah. So that helps you orient, because I think a lot of the public that lived through 08 or is cautious or concerned that it might happen again, they don't necessarily remember that part of it, right? Mm-hmm. That, nowadays we can look up any information about a lot of markets right on our phone in 13 seconds. Well, that was when the iPhone first came out. We were getting excited about pretty slow loading pages on our phones, but we had it for the first time. And so the biggest reason why I think I'm excited about the future of real estate and us providing more value and clients making better decisions is, again, we just have more visibility. Now we just have to it's a lot of noise.
Yeah.
So we have to be able to cut through that and see what's really happening and not get caught off guard by the headlines that can throw us off our game. But we have the tools now that we didn't have before. And so it doesn't mean that a 2008 won't necessarily happen. But when you look back at the data that is now available, we could have had a heads up 2 years ahead, right? Like Miami was really heading downhill quickly a year before Jacksonville started to see that stuff, which would, bleed over into the St. Augustine market. And so I think that we just didn't have the visibility. And so everybody got caught off guard, and maybe the people that were in it, just never wanted it to end. But nowadays, what I'm trying to do is be independent of the transactions, have an organization totally separate of brokerages and lenders and all of that stuff, and be somebody who's able to look at this and isn't like, I want this to happen. I'm able to just say, well, what is happening? And let's make sense of it. And then can give, realtors and their clients and all that stuff, that objective, independent information. That's hopefully where we see the future take us. Yeah.
And that kind of segues because how you mentioned like Miami versus Jacksonville, you brought up a really good chart here and like keeping relativity, like what's going on in our market, what's going on with the nation versus Florida versus Naples to Jacksonville, Naples to St. Augustine, and they're very different, right? So comparing Naples to Northeastern Florida, can you kind of shine some light on what's going on there?
Yeah. So the hard part is a lot of what I do is I just look at the numbers, and I don't necessarily have the on the boots knowledge of what's happening to drive the numbers a certain way. So for me to be able to tell you, well, Naples has almost 10 months of inventory and it's because of X, Y, and Z. I don't know the X, Y, and Z. That's where I think there's real big value that can be had from the agents that are paying attention to this stuff. Because if I'm able to point out, oh, this is what's happening to the months of inventory in Naples, the agent then can connect the dots of, oh yeah, well, we've seen, we had a lot of people relocating from New York and now they're not coming here anymore because, believe it or not, Naples is the most expensive market in Florida. Yeah. Okay, well now it starts to make sense. But what I think is valuable is seeing the numbers without having the potential bias of knowing that local market. And I can be objective and just say, well, here's what the numbers tell me, right? Okay. The other market that comes to mind is Punta Gorda. Punta Gorda is, when I look at markets that are potentially at risk, it's got 8 months of supply. Now, I remembered that a hurricane went through part of the state, and I had to look up, hey, did the hurricane hit here? And sure enough, it did, right? So that could be the reason why they have so much inventory is hurricane hit recently. People are not interested in living where a hurricane recently hit. Yeah. Although it might be the safest place to live. I don't know. It depends on if you think lightning will strike twice. But but having this visibility, seeing the different parts of the state, and ultimately, the South is south of Florida, and West Coast and East Coast of the South are getting a lot of the relocation from New York, maybe even from the international people, whereas the Northeast is, I think, getting more certainly from the Northeast in terms of the United States, but we're also getting the Atlantas and the Texas and the LAs, maybe a little bit more of the non sort of New York hedge fund crowd, if you will. And that can change those markets a little bit.
For sure. Yeah. And I think with that as well is when we're talking about people, right? Because we're talking about residential real estate for the most part. People are moving down here, whether they're retiring or they work remote or they got another job down here. Florida just got rated #1 economy in the United States. There's a lot of things that are changing here that, 5 years ago, I don't even think that was on the board. But now things like Florida being the #1 economy, though we were already pretty high out there before, it seems to have all changed very rapidly. So not only do we have people moving down here, but we also have companies moving down here as well.
Sure. It's one of those things where I think when you start to dive into all of the things driving the growth of Florida, the fundamentals are all there, right? It's a diverse set of industries. It's you look at Northeast Florida, we have finance, we have healthcare, we have the military, we have education, we have a lot of different things that are driving that growth. So it's not just hinging on if this one industry does well, we'll be great. If not, then we're in trouble, right?
Yeah.
Miami's probably driven a little bit more by the finance side of things, but they're such a big facet of our economy that they have everything. It's just sort of what stands out the most. You look at the logistic side of Northeast Florida as well. Our ports, our railroads, all that stuff. So when you dive into that, it's crazy. And my good friend, and him, Steve Shane, sent me a video yesterday.
Yeah.
Talking about how Florida is driving so much of the overall economic growth of the country because we are the fourth largest economy. Mm-hmm. And it's this brain drain where if you're someone who's really capable and you live in Georgia or you live in any of these areas, you're moving with your feet to go seek better opportunity because there's not that much opportunity where you are. And so we're attracting a lot of those people. And so when you look at the people moving here, they're employed, they are productive, they are in a lot of cases either retiring or millennials, mm-hmm. right? So there's a lot of that, but it's an exciting time. And I think it's something that if I'm looking at real estate and owning real estate and all that, what's behind it, this is a great opportunity. And it's something that a lot of people are scared about buying at the top. And we talk about this. Yeah. But you're always buying at the top when you look at the numbers, right? Yeah. 87% of the time, the real estate market is at a peak. You just sort of are looking back at it, thinking about how great of a deal it was. But if you didn't know the future, you didn't know all those other years, you're always at the peak as you're moving. And so that sort of opens up your mindset to being like, oh, okay, well, it isn't a crazy idea to think that it's still a good time to buy. Yeah. Growth is happening in a lot of cases. And a lot of that will happen as long as we print money. Yeah.
And I don't think they're not going to turn that printer off anytime soon, but we'll see what happens with that. I think also the one thing that most people, at least a lot of the locals here, they in our generation, right? Like I feel like you've seen that meme where it's like, how many once in a lifetime events are we going to go through? You know, and it's like that's kind of how our whole generation feels. It's like the rug's pulled out from under us every single time you get a footing, almost, right? And people remember 2008. Maybe they weren't necessarily affected. You were in college. I was in high school at that point, so like I wasn't really affected by 2008. I couldn't get a job once I got out of high school, like even a part-time job, but like I didn't have a family support or anything. Right. I didn't have a mortgage, Right. So you saw objectively from the outside what was happening, but you didn't have that pressure, right? And now people kind of see that same thing happening again, where it's like housing prices have shot up so much in our local area. So if you are a local and you're not making the same money of all these people that are moving in, you're looking at this and you're like, this is crazy. Like, what am I going to do? And it kind of puts you in a analysis paralysis because it's hard to see through the tree or see the forest through the trees mm-hmm. in that situation because you're just thinking that the market's not going to do you any favors. Right. Yeah. But if you're looking at the market and you look historically, that what I think in our area, it goes up, what has been 6% for the past 5.8%. Yeah. 5% over the past like 50 years or something like mm-hmm. that on mm-hmm. average, if you just do that smooth straight line. Mm-hmm. And that's great information right there. So it's like, even if we're not at the peak and we're going down, well, you can almost guarantee that you're going to buy property at a lower price and that it will go up, in a matter of time. Right.
Yeah. We get in trouble using the words always and negative and never. Right.
True.
But when you look at the history of real estate, there are periods where maybe it goes up a little bit more, periods where it goes down a little bit, but it is pretty consistent, right? Yeah. And it's one of those things where, again, I go to the idea that we have a economy built on printing money that is not fixed, right? Like none of these would necessarily exist if we had a set amount of money, but because we have this always growing supply of money, prices tend to always rise, right? Mm-hmm. Now, again, they don't always rise, but they tend to rise over time. And so it goes to the idea of, if you can understand these concepts, if you're thinking about buying or thinking about selling or whatever, you'll make smarter decisions, because we go through life. And like you said, we have these one-offs that are once in a lifetime events that then create a bias in our brain where suddenly, we think a certain way because of the experiences we've had.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that that's reality. That's our reality.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that that's the market's reality. And there are plenty of people that have continued to miss out on the market and the gains and they're accomplishing their goals, more importantly, because they've been scared of something happening again. Right. Yeah. Myself included, when we went through the COVID stock market crash, right? Like I kept waiting for the market to just roll over on the recovery and for things to just continue their downslide. And so I missed out on a lot of that. And it's okay. It is what it is, but it is a great example of if you're looking at these markets and you're expecting things to fall, chances are better by far 9 times out of 10 that things are going to rise over time, just when we look at what's happened over history. And so that I'm like, if you're a betting person, play the odds. 9 times out of 10 is better than anything you'll get anywhere at a casino, right?
For sure. Yeah. And was it Warren Buffett or one of the great financial gurus, like time in the market is better than timing the market? Is that
100%. Yeah. Him and Charlie Munger. It's, the majority of Warren Buffett's wealth has come in the last 5-10 years of his life because of the power of compounding. A book I always recommend to my students at UNF is The Psychology of Money. And it goes through the behavioral finance, and it shows the stats, right? Like they did a study of the best performing accounts at Fidelity. And the common factors they found were either that the person had forgotten they had the account, so they just didn't touch it. They stayed invested and they didn't touch it, or they had died and the account hadn't closed. And so it just been invested without touching it. And so, real estate's sort of the same kind of thing as the stock market of you got to be in it to have any chance of getting any of the gains or keeping up with the market. Right. And the longer you're in it, in general, the more you make, right? Now, that doesn't mean you can't buy and sell and trade and all that stuff and do really well. But it's one of those things where if I'm a seller, the stats really say you should never sell.
Yeah.
Now, life dictates otherwise, but and if I'm a buyer, it's sort of like, how early can you buy real estate in your life? Because the people that are able to buy early on in life are going to do far better than the people that wait.
Yeah. And you know what? Like, this is what I tell millennials for the most part. Now, different advice for different people, but like, do you want to buy a house? Sure. Right? Like, take out all the stats and everything that we're going to cover here. Do you want it? Right. And it's like, well, if you want it, just go buy it, like, and obviously that's
so American of you.
To me, it's just like, well, that's something that was a reach for me, is like, man, I let alone I have 2 houses now, but it's like, I'm looking to buy a condo in Puerto Rico now. Right. So it's like, it's awesome to me to be able to feel that way and be able to say that. But at the end of the day, it's like, I wanted all those things. You know what I mean? So it's like, whether it's a good time or a bad time, like I want to do it. And it has to be a smart decision. Don't get me wrong, like for you and your financial situation. But like that, I think that's the first question. It's like, hey, do you want to buy a house? How long do you plan on living here? The next question. Like, if you're going to live here for 5 years, you're probably going to be fine on your investment. You're probably going to make some money on it. Or most people don't like to call their primary resident an investment, but
it is a liability.
Yeah, liability.
But it's when you sell it, it can produce a lot of value for you.
You're going to take that money and put it in another house more than likely, right? So to me, it's like, okay, and you put a great graph up there, and I think I have it down here somewhere, but where you talked about owning, if you owned it for 2 years, then you owned it for 5 years, and you owned it for 10 years, and how you come out at the other side of that. And it was like, at the worst point of it, I think it was like 25% of people had a loss if it was 2 years, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
So what we're talking about here is, if you're going to only own a house for a couple of years, pretty much anything can happen, right? In a couple of years, there could be a war, there could be a weather event, there can be a lot of stuff, and values can go down in the short term. But what we have seen is that the numbers say that if you own a house for about 7 years or longer, the risk of losing money, even through the 2008 crisis, if you bought before the crash, went through the crash, didn't sell, didn't have to do your foreclosure, didn't do all that, and kept holding, as long as you held 7% or 7 years or 8 years, you would have basically broken even, and the crash would not have caused you to lose anything, right? And so time can lower your risk on an investment like this. And maybe that's a challenge for our generation, is we don't like to own things for very long. We want instant gratification,
Very
and
true.
we're in that world where we've been trained for that. But if you're super concerned about losing money, if you're very risk adverse, then the way that you counteract that is you plan on owning something long term, right? And over time, prices tend to rise. Yeah. And so even if you go through some great crisis, if you plan on being in that house for 7 or 8, 9 years, you're probably going to at least break even if you go through a 2008 type crash.
Yeah. And sorry, I want to interject here, but like a lot of people are mad, like at least our generation are mad at the baby boomers, right? For selling their house in New York or California or wherever, even here, and cashing out and going somewhere else for cheaper living, right? And it's like that generation stayed, right? They stayed in there. That they bought that house in 1998. They stayed there till 2024 and sold it 2023. They put their time in,
Sure.
and that property accumulated a lot of wealth for them, which they're now using in their golden years, right? Like to retire. And I think that's awesome. That's what I hope I can do. Right. And that's why I'm buying property, right? That's why I'm interested in it. It's because like, to me, it's all a get rich slow scheme, right? It's not to happen overnight, but it's something that like you can almost, if you're a betting man, like you said, 9 times out of 10, it's going to go up. And you're going to live in it, or you're going to rent it out. Mm-hmm. I mean, to me, it just makes all the sense in the world,
Yeah, I tell my daughter this all the time because it seems like we as people naturally take this point of view for whatever reason. But being mad at the baby boomers for the way that the housing market is, in my opinion, being a victim.
Yeah.
Right? It's a victim mindset. Mm-hmm. And it's you basically saying it's somebody else's fault that you can't have what you want. And, whether I would say first and foremost, it's the government and the Fed and all the money printing and all that stuff. Right. But if you want something, it's up to you to earn it and go work to get it. Right. And anybody who's been given something versus has worked to earn it knows that if you've worked to earn it, it's so much sweeter than if it's just given to you. You don't appreciate it if it's just given to you. For and sure. So I think when we look, the other piece of this is there's always opportunity, right? Yeah. When we put these blanket statements out here and we say housing's unaffordable or the baby boomers have ruined it. Okay, well, here's the flip side of it. And I just saw this. There's like $30 trillion of wealth that will be passed down from the baby boomers to the next generation when the baby boomers are gone. Mm-hmm. Now, I would much rather have my parents than any amount of wealth, right? But time is going to flip the script on that. And suddenly, I think there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be like, oh man, my parents really took care of me, or maybe I didn't know about that, or all these houses are now available that we can now and take advantage of. Or if it's not affordable, go find where it is, right? Yeah. And we already know this when we pull the stats every month in Jacksonville, which includes the 5 counties: Clay, Baker, Duval, St. John's, and Nassau. The average, you look at the average price point around town, there is a lot of $250,000 houses. For sure. Right. The issue is not that there's not affordable housing. The issue is, will you live in that affordable housing? Does that meet your requirements and your standards? And it's okay if it doesn't, but I don't think you can complain because you want, champagne for a beer budget. Right. Yeah. First house I bought was half a duplex. Yeah. And you live in it, and then you move out and you make it a rental. And it's like, make lemonade where you can. Yeah. And I think that's also the hard thing is like immediate gratification generation. Social media gets you your dopamine rush, all that kind of stuff. They want the acre or half acre house, white picket fence, single family home, 4 bedrooms, 2 baths. They want a familial house. And it's like, why don't you just dip your toe in, get a condo, get a townhome, something, because like homeownership, I bought this house last year. I'm in West Augustine, so it's not the most desirable neighborhood. It's a 1,100 square foot house, 3 bedroom, 2 bath. Bought it for $300,000. Not ideal for most people, but it works for me and my wife right now. We're going to turn it into an investment property. It's a great, absolutely. Because it's a mile from downtown St. Augustine. So I see this being a good Airbnb opportunity, but it's not necessarily what I want, right? It's just like, hey, this is the opportunity that I had available. And it's like, if I had my choice, I'd be on the intercoastal with a 50-foot dock and a boat lift,
But
that's the sixth house, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what you got to work up to,
Yep.
right? So I think that's a hard thing for a lot of people is like, hey, get it, and also just taking care of this house. The grass, and I'm sure you saw it. It drives me nuts, man. It drives me absolutely nuts taking care of that grass. Like it's not fun, and if that's just something I have to deal with, right? It's part of home ownership, but like that's something, if you live in a condo or a townhome, much easier living. Do you have to deal with HOA? Yes. But if you're dipping your toe in, that's probably the best place for you to start, because like homeownership is tough. It's not easy to do.
Well, and if I could go back and do it over again, I would buy a quadplex with an FHA loan before I had kids, before I had responsibilities, and I would live in one of those units. I'd only have to put 3.5% down, and I would have 3 investment properties right off the bat, right? And not everybody wants that, but again, we can't complain and not take action, right? You can take action and complain if it doesn't work out because you're doing something about it. But like, you got to pick. Beggars can't be choosers, right? That's the issue. And I think it's funny to get to the stage in life where you start to say, like, the older I get, because I'm still not that old, but you just start to realize that like the value and the purpose of a lot of this is like, we're on an adventure. Like, go live the adventure. Don't try to just like get to the end in step one, because the fun part is going along the journey.
It's the journey for sure. Yeah,
absolutely.
And that's one thing you talked about earlier. And, let's talk about the challenges facing the market. You mentioned like a hurricane, potential recession, right? What do you think are the biggest challenges, not only facing like our local market here, but our national market?
Yeah. So it's important that we start by saying that I'm a firm believer that we should not play what if. We should focus on what's probable. And we can play what if for a little bit and talk about that. My daughter peppers me with what if questions, and I have to tell her, like, baby, like, you can't just play what if your whole life, because people that play what if don't ever take action. They don't ever make decisions because they're paralyzed by what if this happens and the what if this happens, right? It doesn't mean it's not a valuable exercise for us to think about what are the risks, but we can't get caught up in the not likely black swan events. Nobody sees the black swan coming. That's the issue with the black swan. It's very impactful, but arguably it's impossible to prepare for, because that's the nature of it. I think being out of real estate now, no longer being a mortgage banker, no longer having a stake in the deals, have a little bit more of a maybe neutral opinion about the market than I did when I was in it. When you're in it, you want things to go well because your livelihood depends on it. Now, to be fair, I mean, I coach with realtors. If you guys stop having success in real estate, then I have no business, right? There's trade-offs there. But in general, I feel like being out of the game, I can see it a lot more clearly. And having gone to Florida and getting my doctorate and understanding how research is done, that all was designed for me to have a clearer picture of reality. The things that I worry about is right now that there's pretty good signs that stagflation could be real. Yeah. I remember putting that on a presentation like 2 or 3 years ago. And it's like, do we have inflation? Do we have deflation? Or do we have stagflation? It's kind of like, we don't know yet, because the market's changing and we're not sure what we're going to get. The economy appears to be slowing down, and the inflation appears to be coming back up. And that's what stagflation is. It's basically this sort of like terrible situation of prices rise while the economy gets worse. And normally when the economy gets worse, prices go down. And so there's some offsetting things there. That is, I think, a realistic concern. So anybody who's thinking rates are going to fall, in that environment, they don't, right? Maybe they stay the same, but if inflation ends up being 3-4%, mortgage rates, just by that nature, usually cannot be that low, right? They're going to be a couple points above where the inflation rate is. And the whole idea behind that, like, why does inflation matter to mortgage rates, is because it's a loan. And if I'm going to give you money today and you're going to pay me money in the future, if I can't buy very much with the money I get in the future because prices have gone up so much, I'm going to need you to pay me more money. And so that's why people see, as inflation happens, interest rates go up. And the Fed they've been playing this game where it's kind of like, should we cut rates? Should we not cut rates? And a lot of people are waiting for sort of some definitive action there. But them keeping the rates where they are is also going to keep rates high. And so I'm far more open to the idea that rates will be higher than people think for longer.
Yeah.
And the positive side of that, though, is that we will get used to that, and that we will find a way, because I think in general, you look at the American population, we're like go-getters. We are going to find a way to make something work. Maybe companies like Starbucks or this, you turn off your Netflix or whatever, right? Like all the discretionary stuff, you shift around your budget so that you can make the house work, because eventually you're going to value that. But for now, we have the market's a third cash. So even then, rates aren't affecting that many people as they were before. It's still cheaper to buy real estate in Florida compared to where all the people that are coming from. Yeah. So it's always relative there. But that's probably the biggest concern I have. All the rest of it is totally conspiracy theory and cannot be justified, even though it's fun to think about. Will Florida and Texas join forces and unite and create our own country? Who knows? Yeah. Those are the conversations that are really entertaining to think about. But I think the future is probably far more bland than we really think. Yeah. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at that. I do think that we're starting to see shenanigans with the election already. Yeah. And one of the things we talked about in our coaching group is make the first half of the year count, because the second half isn't guaranteed, right?
Well, and that's what you hear a lot from clients and customers is just like, hey, I'm going to wait until I see what happens with this election. And it's like, even the data that you've shown, it's like, doesn't matter. Sure. Like at the end of the day, it's like, hey, life is going to go on as normal. Whoever's in the White House, it's going to make a menial change and maybe a slight change in interest rates, based on who comes in. Yeah. But it's pretty much negligible. If you're looking, or is it worth delaying your decision 6+ months because of that? I wouldn't say so. It's not like, oh, well, if Donald Trump gets in office, interest rates are going to go to 4.5%. Like there's no data that's going to correlate with that. Right. That's what a lot of people hope. And it's a pipe dream. Right. And like, hey, if that happens, cool. Right. But then there's also data that says like, if Biden's there, then typically under Democrats in interest rates do better. Right. Yeah. So we're in this weird world. And I think we will be until the election happens, because a lot of people hinge their life based off of this organization that controls us,
Yeah, that's a tough one, because we play what if there a lot. Yeah. And I think philosophically, there is a lot that our government impacts us with. The question I always sort of come back to, and this is where, my baby boomer parents very much disagree with my millennial beliefs here, but, they are consumed by politics. And I think it's out of wanting the best for us, right? They see changes happening and they want us to live in a great environment. And so they care a lot about politics because they believe that ultimately changes, how our lives are going to go. Maybe it's millennial naivete on my end to believe this, but I just sort of feel like it doesn't matter what they do. It's two wings of the same bird. And that what I want to spend my time focusing on is being impactful for the things that I can control, which are my family and the realtors I work with and my students, and trying to control what I can control. And you do what you can to make it as good as possible. But at the end of the day, who gets elected? I don't know. I've lived a long time and we've had a lot of different presidents, a lot of different parties. And I don't know that it changes too much in our day-to-day life. Now, again, there are probably people that are going to be like, blasphemy.
We're gonna get roasted.
Right. But I think in general, my life is a lot less stressful when I don't pay attention to the news or politics. And you just make the best of what you can control.
Yeah, I agree with that. 100% agree with that. Especially like you are paying attention to something, but it just happens to be data, like in what our world is, right? Our world is obviously our family, but our jobs as well. Yeah. And just like, those things coincide a lot, right? How well we do in our family life helps us in our job life, though we may not think of it that way. And how well we do in our jobs helps us in our family life. And And then there's also negatives to that too. So I don't know. I think for sure, you come home a bad day, you're like, your wife has to hear about it,
Yeah. Let me tell you, an unhappy wife is far worse than anyone who gets elected.
Yeah.
I'm going to say that right now, right?
That's
actually, same thing with the kids. Same thing with the dogs. That matters in our lives far more.
Yeah. So if your wife wants to move to Florida, listen to her,
exactly.
Like just let it happen.
Well, and you bring up a good point. So, I don't mean to advertise like I don't pay attention to what's happening in the world, right? Like I pay attention, but I don't watch the news.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily read the articles the way that a normal person would read them. I read them with basically like, okay, now what do I have to go look up to figure out what the truth is?
Yeah.
Right. And these days, that's my encouragement to any realtor, to any person who's thinking about anything they're doing. It's kind of like if you read an article and your gut immediately is like, oh, I should sell everything, right? Or like, oh, there's going to be civil war or whatever. Like, just know it's designed to make you feel that way and get that emotional response. And so the best thing we can do is just use it as either don't pay attention to it or, okay, well, let's go look up the truth, because now data is available more than it's ever been.
Yeah.
And sometimes you just have to know where to look. But that's been a big focus that I've found a lot of enjoyment in, is just kind of like people just slice and dice the data in certain ways to create a narrative. And then when you zoom out over history, suddenly the picture gets a lot clearer and you go, oh, well, that was just like fear mongering. That was just to get clicks.
Yeah.
Like the truth is totally different than what they're advertising. Right. And so I feel like every day I could probably take an article off Redfin or an article off some news site and basically go, that's not like, technically that's true, but you're just looking at it in a very small lens that makes it feel totally different than it is.
Yeah. Like, oh, the market's crashing. Like people have been saying like the market's going to crash since 2015, like at least that's what I've been hearing.
Yep.
And it's like 2019 market's going to crash, 2020 market's going to crash, 2020. And in reality, I think this is what I kind of try to get across people in the past 2 years. Like there has been a market crash. It's not the one you think about, it's
transaction crash.
It's a transaction crash. Exactly. Yeah. Whereas like, people's livelihood and the economy surrounding around real estate has changed drastically since 2022, right?
Yep.
Because there's just not nearly as many transactions. Now, of course, I think what's happening is like we had such a peak in 2021 with like 6.5 million transactions. And then 2022 was still strong, but started to taper off towards the end of the year because of interest rates.
Yep.
But in 2023, 2024, we're kind of stuck in this weird space, right? Like I think it's a little bit of a reactionary to how crazy our market was for 2021, where we needed to slow down. We needed to pull back slightly.
Yep.
And that's not necessarily a pullback on prices, right? Even though that's what it sounds like. It's a pullback on the transactions and how much of it is happening, you know? At least that's my perspective on it.
Yeah. I think the number of people calling for a crash is actually a healthy thing, because nobody was calling for a crash in 2008.
Yeah.
Right. We should be nervous when nobody expects the market to crash. But when what feels like half of the population thinks that the market's going to crash, I'm like, that's not bad. We probably won't crash because people are looking for it. People are trying to find it. People are paying attention to it. People are not speculating without regard to the market like they were in 2008. I mean, that's the biggest difference, right? People were buying a house, expecting it to appreciate. The only reason they bought the house is because they thought it was going to go up and then they could sell it and make the money. Yeah. Nowadays, people are just trying to buy a house to live in, right? And there's so many people on the sidelines waiting for it to crash that they may eventually decide to go in. And the day that nobody's calling for a crash is the day that I'll be like, we should be a little concerned, right?
That's a problem. Yeah. Well, and I think this rolls into our next topic. The reason that people are holding off on a transaction is really down to interest rates, I would say. Like economy plays an important part of that as well. But I think like the interest rates rose so rapidly that it kind of was like the sticker shock, to a lot of people. And now it feels that it's more or less people are adjusting and it's normal and things are like, this is what it is. So can you talk a little bit about interest rates, inflation, where we came from and where we are today?
Sure. Yeah. So I've got a variety of major factors that I think are contributing to the inflation, right? We have this new phenomenon of if there's a problem, I call it new, but if there's a problem with the economy, our solution is to print money. Mm-hmm. Okay. And we started this around 2008. Now the difference is they sort of had the crash and then had to figure out what they were going to do about it. And so there was this big delay in when they started to print money to fix the problem. And so we had the pain of the crash before we potentially had the gain of printing all the money. Fast forward to 2023, by the way, we had three of the four largest banks ever fail. And in one weekend, they printed enough money to solve it. And there was no pain. Right now, people lost jobs if they worked for those banks, or they had issues if they but that was in California, New York primarily, and people in Florida felt it none.
Yeah.
So we've been printing a lot of money, and when we did it in 2008, it never really impacted the public. And the reason why is because a lot of the money they printed stayed into the corporate world, right? They gave the money to the companies to keep them afloat, and the companies basically bought back stock with it. And, so the financial markets took off and did really well after they sort of did their correction, but it never really translated to higher food prices. It didn't translate to higher everything prices because the money stayed in the financial markets. If we go to now COVID and the pandemic, well, we sent checks to everybody. And at that time, you either learned how to day trade, how to bet on sports, or you paid your credit card off, right?
Yeah.
Those seem like the three activities that most people did with that money.
I lost some money day trading, with that stimulus.
It's always good to learn early on with little effort that it's not as easy as it looks, right?
No.
But because they gave everybody the money and the markets were doing what they're doing and people were making a lot of money because there was just more money, then it translated into the higher food prices and the higher everything. And people get this confused. They think that inflation is the increasing of prices. And it's not. The increasing of prices is like your cough to a cold, right? I have a cough, but my issue is that I have a cold. The cough is a symptom of my cold, right? My runny nose is a symptom of my cold. If I stop my nose from running, it does not mean that I don't have the cough anymore. It just means that I've stopped my symptom. Printing money is the source of inflation, right? If we didn't print the money, prices would not have risen. But because we printed the money, prices went up because there's more money chasing fewer goods, right? And it was this perfect storm. And so anyway, I want to be clear about that, because until we fix the heart of the issue, which is the continuation of money printing, we're probably going to have the inflation issue. And I think that also so much money's still sitting on the sidelines that they would call that dry powder. It's people that have a bunch of money that they're waiting to invest for the right moment, that it's tough to see a time where the money isn't continually going into the markets. But that ultimately had us go from 2% roughly on inflation all the way up to 7 or 9, depending on how you measure it. And now we're back down to between 2 and 4, depending on how you measure it. Yeah. And a good book for anybody who's interested in this is called The Inflation Myth. I've learned this from getting my doctorate, but how you measure things matters. And there's all these different acronyms, CPI, PCE, PPI, all that different stuff that are these government ways that they measure inflation. And they're designed to try to measure something, but they're imperfect. So an example would be if in the CPI, they're basically trying to take a bunch of different prices, put it in a bag, and see overall, is the bag getting more expensive or less expensive? And one of the things they'll do is substitution. So if the price of steaks goes up a lot, they will just put in the price of ground beef, because they're going to assume that because steak is expensive, you're going to just start to buy ground beef. And so now inflation is artificially low compared to what reality is, because reality is a steak is still really expensive. Same thing with housing, right? They measure the cost of housing by calling people and saying, how much would you rent your house for? That's not a very accurate measure.
Yeah.
Now people...
Very subjective.
Correct.
Yeah.
And it's not the only way they measure housing, but it's called owner's equivalent rent, and it's a big way they measure it. I would actually argue these days, so that has been higher than everybody's expected. And everybody's like, inflation should be a lot lower. The cost of rent, the cost of housing is not going up as fast. Well, if I'm looking and getting called and saying how much would you rent for a house for, and I continue to raise my price, I actually think that that's a pretty good measure of inflation because I'm renting it more because everything's costing me more. Yeah. So it's kind of a little counterintuitive, but we're just at this weird stage where I think it's just sticky inflation because we've printed so much money and we're already sort of done turning the spigot and tightening it, right? The Fed did this whole tightening thing where they said inflation's too high. We got to fight that. So we're going to print less money. Mm-hmm. Well, now we're at the point where if the economy is sort of slowing down, we'll probably print some more money. Yeah. We already did it when the banks crashed. Most likely we'll do it again. Probably going to see inflation stick around longer, which is why I think rates will be where they are or higher or somewhere around there for the foreseeable future.
Yeah. So with interest rates, where do you see, obviously no one has a crystal ball here, but with interest rates, we have inflation. Inflation is expected to stick around for a little bit longer. Do we know if the Fed's going to do a cut? Maybe in September, but not likely through the summer, correct? And the Fed doing a cut to the federal funds rate then could correlate to the 10-year treasury starting to go down, which then correlates to the mortgage interest rate starting to go down.
Sure.
So that could be higher for longer, like people are saying. So on average, we have 7.75% is the average interest rate
long term. Yeah. Like over all the history that we have of mortgage rates back into the 70s, 7.75 is the average.
So what would you, as a betting man, you would say that interest rates are probably where they're going to be, if we're looking at the long-term average, right?
Yeah. What you need to do is you need to spend your time focusing on what you can control, right? Mm-hmm. So if I'm thinking about buying, if it's an investment, I'm thinking about buying and just finding an investment that works, right? And there are investments that work, even though rates are high. The hard part is it may not be a turnkey one, right? I was looking at a deal that doesn't necessarily make sense as is, but with some renovations and getting the rent up, suddenly the cash flow makes all the sense in the world, even at rates being the highest, right? So the opportunities are probably just getting harder to find, but they're not going away entirely. And so, if you're hoping to shoot fish in a barrel, that market may be gone, but that doesn't mean that there's not opportunity. There's always opportunity, and it's something that can present itself if you look for it, or if you're, like we've said earlier, more open to other areas or to different parts of town or different types of living situations, different types of houses, all that stuff. And none of it necessarily has to be permanent. You just have to be open to the idea of, hey, I'm going to live here for a year or two, and then I want to keep the house and move on from it. Or, just make it something where we'll turn it into something else, and it solves our needs in the meantime.
So let's talk about our local market here and what's going on here. Obviously, I'm focused on St. Johns County.
Yep.
Average sale price or median sale price is up 8% year over year.
Yep.
Right. And we're definitely the most expensive county out of the 5 that make up the Jacksonville Metro Service Area. Maybe for
Nassau might be competing. Yeah. Nassau and St. John's run together, and Clay and Duval.
Yeah.
So it depends on the month because Nassau is a much smaller market, but Nassau's up there with St. John's.
Yeah. So what would you say for St. Johns County is driving our market here?
Well, obviously it's the new construction, right? That's the easy answer straight out the gate. And they're paying people to live here, right? Mm-hmm. You can get a great deal on a newly built house because they're going to buy your interest rate down. They're going to give you closing cost credits. They're going to give you money at the design center, whatever it is, right? Now, they're not flexing on the price. Mm-hmm. They will keep their prices elevated and rising because that is sort of what's needed to keep the appraisals happening and keep the whole operation afloat. But they're happy to give you all these other incentives in different ways. I think that as much as people talk about the schools, there's actually no correlation between prices and schools, which is a surprising finding that I had. Everybody assumes you moved to St. John's because of the schools, but I think you moved to St. John's because you can get a really nice house that's brand new with some really good incentives in a lot of cases.
Well, I also think that has to do with Duval County, right? Because let's say if you're not working remote, you're more than likely working in Jacksonville, right? And Jacksonville being a huge huge city in general, but for the most part, all the land has been built out. They only have a handful of master plan developments. I can think of to my end, Seven Pines offhand, E-Town, right? And those Seven Pines and E-Town,
and E-Town's on the
it's
cusp
like,
of being
right,
in St. John's,
right there, yeah. So it's like between those, pretty much all the rest of the area there has already been developed by older housing inventory.
Mm-hmm.
So if you just go a step south, you know, and you're in the northern part of St. Johns County, where there was literally rural land for miles and miles, and now is being developed in a master plan community, you kind of get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, all the action in Jacksonville primarily is happening in the north side and in St. John's. And that's because that's where the new construction builders are. And a lot of it, I mean, sure, they are paying you, but it's also available housing, right? We have this lock-in effect that's happening where all of the people have purchased homes. They have 3% mortgage rates and they're not selling. And so the available inventory has just drastically dropped so that it's actually really hard to find a good house that you want to buy unless you go to these new construction communities. The good news is we're seeing inventory rise. A lot of people are sort of sketched out about that because it is a warning sign if it rises uncontrollably, but sales are actually picking up because we have more inventory. So I think because there are more options for people to buy, they're more likely to buy a house. And there have been plenty of people sitting on the sidelines over the last 2 years. In many cases, probably waiting for a house in a certain neighborhood or something like that to come available. And we're starting to actually see that happening, which is creating more opportunity and more sales, which is a good thing. That's a sign of a healthy market. We need inventory to actually have grease in the engine to keep it going. And I've always felt like the risk that we have in Northeast Florida and probably Florida in general is our markets freezing up because we sort of sell out of housing. In fact, if you look down in South Florida, all of the companies trying to move down there cite the lack of housing as the reason why they can't relocate there yet. Because they would be like, I would move here, but I have 200 employees and they have nowhere to go and they can't get into schools. So if we don't have more schools and more housing, we can't relocate there. Now, the good news is if there's demand, they'll build it. But it's going to take time. And so I think that's some of the other things that if we think, how could this keep going? Well, it's that, right? Like there's a bunch of stuff waiting in the wings that we need the infrastructure to be there before it can actually take place and happen. But that is a ongoing demand that as long as sort of things go in the direction that they're going, which it seems like they will, then there's continued demand on the horizon for a lot of areas in Florida. And maybe some of those companies go, hey, look, we can't wait any longer, Miami. We're going to have to go to Jacksonville. We're going to have to go to Orlando. We're going to have to go to Tampa.
That was kind of my thought because they have the same advantages of being in Florida, right? But then also, you know, our area, we have a lot of great schools within a location, like UNF being one of the greatest,
absolutely,
right?
Swoop.
And then you got UF, right? Not too far away. Like, you know, we have Flagler College here, which is apparently one of the top liberal arts schools in the country. But you have a lot of options here for, you know, employers to get talent, right? And aside from that, we're also way cheaper, you know, in terms of like, hey, your employees can live here and afford to live here. No problem. You know, at least in the metro service area, St. Johns County. You know, Nassau County. But Duval County, Jacksonville for sure.
Well, there's affordability in those two counties too, right? Like 100%. That's the main thing that we want to also get across is when you look at an average for a county, you know, again, it represents the high end and the low end, but there are always opportunities of affordable housing in places. It's, you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like I bought a $300,000 house here in West Augustine. And I mean, is it the most desirable? No, but I'll have the ability to potentially Airbnb this, right, in the future. And also, I think there's a lot of plans for West Augustine, which I just, you know, I keep on top of.
I saw them all driving through here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's like, there's things going on here. And it's just like, are you willing to make a small sacrifice for the potential of the future? And that's kind of how I looked at it. It's like, hey, I'd rather be in Anastasia Island. I'd rather be in St. Augustine South. But, you know, I looked at the opportunity here and I'm like, well, this is going to be an investment for me anyway, because I'm not selling anything I own. At least that's the goal. So why wouldn't I do it? So I made actually all day long. We're super happy here, especially being a mile from downtown. That's amazing. But yeah, then turning this into an Airbnb, I think, is something that would be amazing for me and my wife. You know,
do you have to have a license down here to do that?
So I'm in St. Johns County, so it's different than being in the city of St. Augustine. So they're regulated differently.
Okay, cool.
So yeah, and I know we want to talk about Airbnbs a little bit here
Sure.
before we wrap up. So, and I think that's also part of the economy here, just being 100, because a lot of
it's a big vacation town.
100%. Yeah. So, do you see a softening in the Airbnb market here of what we got going on here in St. Johns County?
Yeah, it's a great question. I had a realtor bring up that she was sort of seeing a liquidation of Airbnbs, meaning a bunch of people were selling their Airbnbs because they either aren't making the money they thought they'd make on them, or it no longer made sense, or they didn't want to do it, or whatever it was, right? And so in part of that, I wanted to pull some of the stats to just say, okay, well, let's see what the numbers say, right? Mm-hmm. And you have to always think first, how am I going to measure what we're talking about? Because if I don't have a way to measure it, then we can't ever know the answer. One of the ways that you can measure Airbnb is through a service called AirDNA, which is awesome. Love those guys. They have an increase of 6% on listings, active listings in the St. Augustine sort of market, which does branch off into St. John's a little bit, not just downtown. But that stat on itself, about 5,100 listings, would tell you that listings are not declining. So if people are selling Airbnbs, they're being purchased and being kept as Airbnbs, right? Which would be, to me, that's not a red flag. That's just sort of properties changing hands. The occupancy rate is down 14% from last year, which is interesting. I think that might it's still 58%, and you need occupancy to be sort of middle of the road, because if there's no availability, people aren't going to come.
Yeah.
Right. So you want to have availability. And the revenue is down about 4% compared to last year. So the average revenue of an Airbnb in St. Augustine, how much do you think it is a year?
I looked at it for another customer. Like 40K?
$50,000.
Is that gross or net?
Gross.
I mean,
it's just revenue. So it's not about profits.
Yeah.
But that's one of those numbers that's shocking to sort of think about. Like, you can make $50,000 revenue, meaning you still have all your expenses you have to pay. You still have all that. But that's a big number to start off with.
Yeah.
Right?
Sure.
Like, that gives you a lot of room. Obviously, if your mortgage payment's $5,000 a month, then that doesn't work.
It doesn't help out.
But if your mortgage payment's $2,500, $3,000, there's still room there.
Yeah.
Maybe it's something where you want to buy an Airbnb and you need to manage it yourself.
Yeah.
Right. Or maybe, there's certain Airbnbs that you can buy and improve, right? Even just painting a mural or having something unique about it, it's going to draw people to it, right? Just being a better host, not charging people for toilet paper, things like that.
Yeah.
But on the surface, when we look at those AirDNA stats, to me, you see a changing market where maybe there's a little bit more supply, and so prices are down a little bit, but it still is a happening market, right? The other thing I looked at is just the active listings in St. Augustine in total, because there's no way for me at this point to be able to go, how many Airbnbs are for sale? Yeah. Because we don't have the visibility to that. We can only say how many houses are for sale. When you look at St. Augustine, the city, St. Augustine Beach, Volano Beach, and St. Augustine South, which are sort of the little areas that make up the St. Augustine vacation market that I would think, we saw basically the market totally sell out in 21, where we basically ran out of houses. There were more in St. Augustine City, but there were almost zero houses in St. Augustine South, Volano Beach, and St. Augustine Beach, which is nuts.
Yeah.
The beach area, as well as St. Augustine South, has rebounded a little bit, but we're still well below where we were in 2019. So we're not seeing a surplus of listings come on the market in those areas. So I don't think there's any sort of Airbnb selling frenzy happening in that place. Probably because, if I'm not mistaken, you have a limited number of Airbnbs, so it's very valuable to own an Airbnb at the beach.
Yeah, within St. Augustine Beach, correct. Yeah.
Right. Now, St. Augustine City, though, is different. It actually made an since 2015 peak in active listings at the end of 23, beginning of this year, where they had a whopping 450 listings. So we have to also remember, like, we're talking about 450 houses. It's not like 4,000 houses, 20,000 houses. But since the beginning of the year, it's fallen down significantly, and we have less than 300 active listings in St. Augustine, the city. Yeah. So to me, that says maybe people were selling them, at the end of last year.
Yeah.
But they went off the market and they're not back on the market.
Yeah.
And I think that speaks to the appetite of people that would invest in those properties if they came up, and they're probably doing that, right?
Yeah.
Even, because there's a lot of cash. And my guess is rates aren't hindering people buying investment properties if they're paying cash.
Yeah.
They're just looking at the revenue that's growing. Is there still demand in the market? So when you put all that data together, the picture I get at St. Augustine is you probably had some flex in the market where people were selling Airbnbs, but it seems like it's subsided.
Yeah.
And that it's gone away, and that there were plenty of demand to come in and soak that up and buy those properties, because now we're back, well below inventory 23 and 22, which is crazy.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. That's crazy. It's insane to think about. And
it's the power of the numbers, because I don't even know the narrative, but I'm just going to look at the numbers and let the numbers tell me what the deal is.
Yeah.
And then you and I can have this sort of discussion about what we think is driving it, right?
Yeah, like my bias behind it as
Sure.
a realtor.
Your insight.
Yeah.
Your insight.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, awesome, man. Well, listen, we tackled a lot of topics today. We need to do 2-3 hour long podcasts to really hammer all this stuff. But dude, I appreciate your mentorship, you being a professor, just like how you give information. It makes it easy for me to understand, and I hope it makes it easy for people out there to understand as well. But yeah, I mean, tell people where they can see it, where they can, what's your Instagram handle? Let them know where they can follow you.
Love it. Yeah. So The Market Distillery is where they can find me, Dr. Alex Stewart.
Okay.
And also themarketdistillery.com. I put out a weekly email every Monday that gives insight on our local markets for free. So anybody can go subscribe to that. I would say this too, like comment in the section on this video if you have questions that you want me and Thomas to explore in the future.
Yeah.
I'd be happy to dive into that. All of the research I do is typically driven by questions clients are asking or questions realtors are asking, because that's what matters.
Yeah.
And we're not here to just look stuff up to look stuff up. I want to look stuff up to answer questions people have.
Yeah.
And so follow me on Instagram, sign up for the newsletter. But most importantly, stay in touch with obviously Thomas and the channel, and focus on finding the truth in the numbers rather than reading into just the headlines.
Love it, man. Love it. Awesome. Awesome, guys. Well, hey, you heard the man. Leave comments if you have any questions. Subscribe if you want to keep following more content like this. We're going to keep coming out with hopefully bigger and better stuff every time we do this. So appreciate you guys. Until next time.